Hey friends, I'm Megan, so glad you're here. We've got a great episode today. Let's get started.
She had always been someone who valued her independence and cherished her personal space. But when it came to relationships, things had never been quite straightforward. From the moment she met him, there was an undeniable connection, a spark that seemed to promise something deeper and more meaningful than any fleeting romance she had experienced before. They spent countless hours talking, laughing, and slowly unraveling the layers of their personalities. At first, everything seemed perfect, a dream unfolding at just the right pace. Yet beneath the surface, she wrestled with a growing unease that she couldn't quite put into words. Intimacy, the very thing that many people longed for in relationships, felt more like a looming shadow, an obligation that pressed on her chest and made her heart race with anxiety. It wasn't about him. It was about her own fears and boundaries that she hadn't yet learned to navigate or express. Clearly, their relationship existed in a delicate balance, a dance of closeness and distance. She wanted to be near him, to share moments that felt genuine and warm. But every time things edged toward a physical closeness, she found herself recoiling inwardly. The idea of being vulnerable in such an intimate way terrified her, stirring up memories and emotions she preferred to keep locked away. Despite the warmth and affection he showed, the growing pressure of physical intimacy weighed heavily on her, a weight she wasn't ready to carry. This created an invisible barrier between them, something unspoken but deeply felt. She convinced herself that if she could just maintain control of the pace, the relationship could survive without crossing into that uncomfortable territory. After all, love wasn't only about physical connection. It was also about emotional understanding and mutual respect. She spent long nights questioning herself, wondering if she was the problem, if her inability to embrace intimacy would eventually push him away. But admitting her fears felt like surrendering to something she didn't want to confront. So she chose silence and avoidance instead. She carefully crafted excuses, feigning fatigue or stress, anything that could explain her reluctance without revealing the deeper truth. Each excuse was a small lie, but to her, it was a necessary shield, a way to protect both herself and the fragile relationship from a collapse she feared might be inevitable. She watched as he grew increasingly confused and concerned, sensing something was wrong but unable to pinpoint the cause. He was patient and caring, always asking if she was okay. But she deflected his questions, not ready to share the turmoil brewing inside her. In the quiet moments alone, she felt the sting of guilt. She loved him, she truly did. But the gap between her heart and her fears felt insurmountable. She feared losing him, yet paradoxically, she feared letting him in even more. The contradictions of her emotions created a storm inside her, turbulent and relentless. Despite the growing distance, she held on to hope that things could work out, that maybe the walls she built around herself could eventually come down. She clung to the memories of their laughter and the tender moments they shared, using them as anchors in a sea of uncertainty. But deep down, she knew that something had to change. Either she had to find the courage to face her fears, or the relationship would unravel beyond repair. This internal battle played out against the backdrop of their everyday lives, where the ordinary routines masked the extraordinary tension simmering beneath. Friends and family saw a couple seemingly happy, unaware of the silent struggle that neither fully understood. She put on a brave face, smiling and engaging in conversations, while inside she was unraveling piece by piece. Each day brought new challenges. Moments when he reached out for connection and she retreated. Moments when his touch felt like a question she couldn't answer. The closer they became emotionally, the more distant she felt physically, trapped in a cycle of wanting and withdrawing that neither of them could break. She wished she could tell him everything, but the fear of being judged or rejected held her back. As weeks turned into months, the tension became a constant presence. An uninvited guest in their relationship. She found herself living in two worlds. One where love and hope still existed, and another where fear and avoidance ruled. Her decision to keep her distance from intimacy was no longer just a personal struggle. It was beginning to shape the course of their shared future. Yet she remained silent, hoping that time would heal the invisible wounds and that somehow things would find their natural rhythm again. The complexity of her feelings, the depth of her inner conflict, and the undeniable bond they shared created a story that was far from simple. A story of love intertwined with fear, connection shadowed by distance, and hope overshadowed by uncertainty. She reached a breaking point when the pressure to be physically close became unbearable. The thought of sharing that level of vulnerability filled her with dread, and she found herself grasping for any excuse to create distance between them. One evening, overwhelmed by a mixture of anxiety and a desperate need to avoid the inevitable, she made the decision to fake being sick. It was not something she had planned meticulously. Rather, it was a spontaneous act born out of fear and a hope to buy herself some time. She told herself that a temporary retreat from intimacy would give her space to breathe, to gather her thoughts, and to avoid the discomfort that came with it. This small lie, seemingly harmless in the moment, was her way of maintaining control over a situation that felt like it was slipping away. Her body language became more withdrawn, and she began avoiding moments where intimacy might arise. She coughed a little more, acted fatigued, and sometimes pretended to have headaches or stomach aches. It was exhausting to keep up the facade, but each fib allowed her to keep the emotional walls intact. She felt a strange mix of guilt and relief. Guilt because she was deceiving someone she cared about, and relief because she was no longer forced to confront her fears head-on. In her mind, this act of feigning illness was a temporary shield, a pause button on the growing expectations she felt unable to meet. Yet, deep down, she knew this was not a sustainable solution. He noticed the change immediately. His concern grew as he saw her retreating further into herself. He was confused by her sudden disinterest in closeness and intimacy, sensing that something was wrong but unable to understand what. Despite his growing worries, he remained patient and gentle, offering support and reassurance. But the more he reached out, the more she pulled away, fearing that revealing the truth would only drive him further away. The distance between them began to widen, unspoken and invisible but deeply felt in every interaction. Every excuse she made to avoid physical connection was a step further down a path that led away from intimacy and closer to emotional separation. As days turned into weeks, her pretense became a routine, and she found herself trapped in a web of lies. It was a delicate balance between hiding her fears and protecting their relationship from collapse. She feared that if he knew the real reason behind her withdrawal, he would feel rejected or think she didn't love him anymore. So she continued to mask her anxiety with excuses, hoping that one day she would feel ready to be vulnerable. But that day never came. Instead, her fabricated illness began to feel like a prison, a barrier not just to physical closeness but to genuine emotional connection as well. Her own fears became the walls that kept them apart. The internal conflict she faced was immense. Every moment spent pretending drained her emotionally and physically. She felt isolated even when he was near, surrounded by a silence that spoke louder than words. Her mind was a battlefield, torn between the desire to be loved and the terror of being exposed. The fear of intimacy was no longer just about physical contact. It had grown into a fear of losing control, of being seen too clearly and losing the safety she clung to. Each day she wore the mask of sickness. She lost a little more of herself, sinking deeper into the role she had unwillingly taken on. Despite the growing distance, she still longed for connection. She wanted to be close to him without fear, to feel safe in his arms and to share herself fully. But the very act of faking illness created a rift that was hard to bridge. She noticed how he began to hesitate, how the warmth in his eyes dimmed just a little with each rejection. It pained her to see him confused and hurt. Yet she couldn't bring herself to break the cycle. The fear was stronger than the love, and the lies became the language of their relationship. She realized that the foundation they had built was cracking, but she was too afraid to admit it, even to herself. In quiet moments, she questioned whether her actions were fair or kind. She knew that avoiding intimacy wasn't just about protecting herself. It was hurting him too. But vulnerability felt like a risk she couldn't take, a leap into the unknown that threatened to shatter the fragile connection they had. She was caught in a paradox, wanting to keep love alive but doing everything to keep it at bay. The more she pushed him away, the more she feared the inevitable loss. Yet she couldn't stop the pattern she had started. As the days wore on, the emotional toll became heavier. She found herself exhausted not only from the act of pretending but from the loneliness that came with it. The sickness she faked became a metaphor for the sickness in their relationship. A distance born not from a lack of love, but from fear and misunderstanding. She could see the toll it took on both of them, yet felt powerless to change course. Her hope that time would heal the rift was slowly replaced by the dawning realization that her actions might have set them on a path from which there was no easy return. The more she tried to protect herself, the more vulnerable she became in other ways. The lie that was meant to shield her from pain became the very cause of it. She was caught between two worlds, the desire for love and the fear of intimacy. And in trying to navigate this difficult terrain, she found herself lost. The story of her pretending to be sick was not just about avoidance. It was about the complex dance between fear and love, control and surrender. It was a story of how one small lie can unravel the strongest bonds, and how sometimes the greatest battles are fought within the heart. The fragile balance that once existed between them began to crumble as the consequences of her decision to fake illness unfolded in ways she hadn't anticipated. The initial relief she felt from avoiding intimacy was soon overshadowed by a growing sense of guilt and anxiety, a silent storm brewing beneath the surface of their relationship. The emotional distance she had tried to control spiraled beyond her grasp, creating cracks that widened with each passing day. He, confused and hurt by her withdrawal, began to pull away emotionally as well, their conversations becoming shorter and less meaningful, their once vibrant connection dimming into a shadow of what it had been. The avoidance that started as a protective measure turned into an invisible wall between them, one that neither knew how to dismantle. She found herself trapped in a cycle of self-recrimination and denial. Every time she made an excuse to avoid closeness, she felt a pang of remorse. But the fear that fueled her avoidance was stronger than the guilt. She replayed every interaction in her mind, analyzing his words, his expressions, searching for clues of how he truly felt, yet unable to bridge the growing gap. The small lies she told to mask her feelings began to feel like chains, binding her to a role she no longer recognized as her own. The tension in the air was palpable, though unspoken, creating an atmosphere thick with unaddressed emotions and unanswered questions. The moments when he reached out for reassurance became the hardest to bear. His attempts to reconnect, to understand what was happening, were met with evasive answers and feigned indifference. She feared that if she revealed her true feelings, the vulnerability would be too overwhelming, and the connection they had might shatter completely. So instead, she retreated further into herself, building higher walls with every passing day. This created a paradox where her efforts to protect the relationship only hastened its decline. The emotional intimacy they once shared was slipping away, replaced by silence and misunderstanding. As the weeks passed, the strain took a toll not only on their relationship but on her own sense of self. She felt isolated even in his presence, burdened by the secret she kept and the widening emotional chasm. The dissonance between her love for him and her fear of intimacy created an internal conflict that was exhausting and demoralizing. She longed for closeness, for the warmth of shared affection, but the fear of being truly seen and accepted held her back. This fear was not just about physical closeness. It was about exposing the vulnerabilities and insecurities she had kept hidden for so long. The consequences of her avoidance extended beyond their personal relationship. Friends and family began to notice the change in her demeanor and the growing distance between them. As a couple, invitations to social gatherings were declined. Phone calls went unanswered, and the lightness that once characterized their interactions faded. She struggled to maintain the facade of normalcy, but the emotional turmoil was evident in her eyes and the weariness in her voice. The isolation deepened, feeding a cycle of loneliness and despair that was hard to escape. He, too, was grappling with his own feelings of confusion and rejection. The patience he once showed began to wane, replaced by frustration and sadness. The uncertainty of her feelings and the lack of communication left him feeling helpless and unsure of how to proceed. The hope that things could return to the way they were dimmed with each unanswered question and each moment of distance. The relationship that had once promised so much now felt fragile and uncertain, teetering on the edge of collapse. In the quiet moments alone, she confronted the reality of what her actions had wrought. The lie that had seemed harmless in the beginning had unleashed a cascade of unintended consequences. The distance she created was not just physical but emotional, a void that neither of them knew how to fill. The fear that had driven her to avoid intimacy had become a barrier that threatened to end the relationship altogether. She faced the painful truth that her avoidance had not protected them but had instead pushed them apart. The emotional toll was immense. She wrestled with feelings of regret and self-doubt, questioning whether she could have acted differently, whether she could have found the courage to face her fears instead of running from them. The realization that her choice had consequences that extended far beyond her own fears was both humbling and heartbreaking. She saw the pain in his eyes, the distance in his voice, and knew that their connection was slipping away like sand through her fingers. Despite the growing chasm, a part of her still clung to hope. She hoped for a chance to make things right, to rebuild the trust and intimacy that had been lost. She longed for understanding and forgiveness, for the opportunity to be vulnerable and honest without fear of rejection. But she also knew that hope alone was not enough. Rebuilding what had been broken would require courage, honesty, and a willingness to confront the fears that had kept them apart. As the cracks in their relationship deepened, she realized that the path forward was uncertain and fraught with challenges. The avoidance that had once seemed like a refuge had become a prison, trapping them both in a cycle of pain and misunderstanding. The journey to healing would be long and difficult, requiring more than just words. It would require a change of heart and a willingness to face the truth. The story of their unraveling was a testament to the complexity of human emotions, the power of fear, and the fragile nature of trust. She understood that she had a choice to make: continue down the path of avoidance and risk losing him forever, or confront her fears and fight for the relationship she still cherished. The weight of this choice pressed heavily on her, a reminder that love was not always enough to overcome the barriers we build within ourselves. The realization that she held the key to either healing or heartbreak was both daunting and empowering. In this moment of reckoning, she stood at the crossroads of fear and hope, uncertain of which path she would choose but knowing that her decision would shape the course of her life and love. As the days grew longer and the emotional distance between them widened, the inevitable rupture loomed closer. Though neither was fully prepared to face it, the fragile threads that once held their relationship together began to unravel with a painful finality. She could sense the subtle shifts in his behavior, the hesitation in his voice, the coolness in his touch, the way his eyes avoided meeting hers. It was as if the warmth that once defined their connection had been replaced by an unspoken resignation. Despite the deep love they had shared, the accumulation of silence, avoidance, and unspoken fears had eroded the foundation of their bond, leaving only cracks and fractures in its wake. The breakup, when it finally came, was not a dramatic explosion but a quiet, heartbreaking dissolution of what once was. The moment of separation felt surreal to her. It was as if time slowed down, and every heartbeat echoed with the weight of what was being lost. She grappled with a storm of emotions, shock, sorrow, anger, and an overwhelming sense of failure. The pain was raw and immediate, cutting through the numbness that had settled in over the weeks of distance. The reality that their story was ending forced her to confront the consequences of her choices. The lies she had told, and the walls she had built, the sickness she had feigned to avoid closeness had instead driven a wedge deep into the heart of their relationship, leaving wounds that seemed too deep to heal. The breakup was a stark reminder that avoidance, no matter how well-intentioned, could never replace honest communication and vulnerability. Soon after their parting, she learned that he had moved on, finding comfort and companionship with someone new. This revelation struck her like a thunderbolt, igniting a fresh wave of pain and jealousy. The knowledge that he had opened his heart to another while she remained trapped in the past felt like a cruel twist of fate. She struggled to understand how he could have moved on so quickly when she was still caught in the web of their shared history. The contrast between their paths, his forward movement and her stagnant heart, highlighted the depth of her emotional paralysis. It was a painful juxtaposition that left her feeling abandoned, insignificant, and desperately alone. The presence of his new girlfriend was a constant, haunting reminder of what she had lost. She found herself obsessively replaying memories of their time together, questioning what went wrong and whether she could have done something differently to change the outcome. The grief she experienced was compounded by a profound sense of inadequacy and self-doubt. She wondered if her fear of intimacy had been a flaw too great to overcome, a barrier too high for love to scale. The image of him with someone else became a symbol of her failure, a representation of the emotional distance that had grown insurmountable. Each thought of their new relationship was a stab to her wounded heart, making it harder to move on. Despite the pain, she found herself unable to let go. The memories of their shared laughter, whispered promises, and quiet moments of connection clung to her like shadows, refusing to fade. She was trapped in a cycle of longing and regret, caught between the desire to move forward and the pull of the past. Her days were filled with restless thoughts and sleepless nights, where she wrestled with the ache of loss and the hope for reconciliation. The emotional turmoil left her feeling fractured, as if a part of her had been left behind in the ruins of their relationship. The inability to move on became a silent torment, a weight that pressed down on her soul. Friends and family noticed the change in her demeanor, the way she withdrew from social gatherings and conversations. Their concern was met with vague reassurances, but beneath her composed exterior, she was unraveling. The isolation deepened as she struggled to reconcile her love for him with the reality of their separation. She questioned her worth and her ability to love and be loved. The breakup had shattered more than just the relationship. It had fractured her sense of identity and self-worth. The journey through heartbreak was lonely and unforgiving, marked by moments of despair and flashes of hope that flickered and faded like distant stars. In this turbulent time, she confronted the complex emotions that accompanied the end of a significant chapter in her life. The bitterness of betrayal mingled with the sweetness of cherished memories. The anger at herself and at him was tangled with a lingering affection that refused to die. The process of grieving was nonlinear, filled with setbacks and small victories. She oscillated between moments of clarity and confusion, between acceptance and denial. The emotional landscape was vast and treacherous, a reflection of the deep human capacity for love and loss. As she faced the reality of his new relationship, she was forced to examine the reasons behind their breakup with unflinching honesty. The avoidance, the lies, the fear of intimacy, all had played a role in the dissolution of what once had been a promising love. This acknowledgement was painful but necessary, a first step toward healing. It opened the door to self-reflection and the possibility of growth. She began to understand that moving on was not about forgetting the past but about embracing it as part of her journey. The lessons learned from their story, though painful, held the potential to guide her toward a healthier, more authentic future. Though the heartbreak was fresh and the wounds raw, she recognized that healing required time and patience. The presence of his new girlfriend was a reminder not only of loss but also of the impermanence of relationships and the resilience of the human heart. She understood that clinging to the past would only prolong her suffering, and that true freedom lay in acceptance and forgiveness of him, of herself, and of the imperfect nature of love. This realization was a quiet but profound turning point, signaling the beginning of a slow journey toward reclaiming her life and rediscovering her own strength. The struggle to move on was a relentless battle fought in the quietest corners of her mind and the loneliest hours of the night. Each day brought a new wave of conflicting emotions, a tempest of regret, longing, and self-recrimination that seemed impossible to calm. She was caught in an endless loop of memories, replaying moments of tenderness and laughter alongside the painful fractures that led to their separation. The presence of his new relationship hovered over her like a shadow, a constant reminder of what she had lost and what might never be reclaimed. The ache of watching him move forward while she remained stuck in the past created an invisible prison, one built from the bricks of fear, guilt, and unresolved pain. She wrestled with the realization that her own actions had contributed to the demise of the relationship, the fear that had driven her to avoid intimacy, the lies she had told to shield herself, and the emotional walls she had erected all played a part in the unraveling of what once had been a deep connection. This acknowledgement was a double-edged sword, offering clarity but also cutting deep with its harshness. She questioned whether she could have been different, braver, more honest. The answers were elusive, buried beneath layers of self-doubt and regret. Yet, in the midst of this inner turmoil, a small flicker of understanding began to grow, a recognition that healing required more than just wishing for the past to return. Her days became a delicate dance between holding on and letting go. She found herself clinging to the hope that reconciliation might still be possible, even as she knew deep down that some wounds ran too deep. The thought of rebuilding what had been broken was both terrifying and alluring. She feared opening herself up again, afraid that the same fears would resurface and that the cycle of avoidance and pain would repeat. Yet, the desire for connection and love was powerful, a beacon that called her toward vulnerability despite the risks. This internal conflict was exhausting, a tug-of-war between protection and openness, between fear and hope. Isolation became both a refuge and a prison. She withdrew from friends and family, reluctant to share the depth of her pain or the complexity of her feelings. The loneliness was suffocating at times, yet the fear of judgment or misunderstanding kept her silent. She struggled to find words that could capture the storm inside her, words that could convey the mixture of sorrow, anger, and longing that defined her experience. This silence created a gulf between her and the outside world, deepening her sense of alienation. Yet, beneath this solitude, the seeds of self-discovery were quietly taking root. She began to confront the parts of herself she had long avoided. The fears, insecurities, and wounds that had shaped her responses and behaviors. This journey inward was painful but necessary. She learned to recognize the patterns that had kept her trapped in cycles of avoidance and regret. She saw how her fear of intimacy was intertwined with past experiences and deep-seated beliefs about worthiness and love. This awareness did not erase the pain but gave her tools to understand it, to hold it with compassion rather than judgment. It was the first step toward reclaiming her agency and rebuilding her sense of self. Throughout this struggle, she grappled with the complex emotions of grief and forgiveness. The grief was multifaceted, not just for the loss of the relationship but for the loss of the future she had envisioned. The dreams that would never be realized. It was a mourning of what might have been, a recognition of the gap between hope and reality. Forgiveness was equally challenging. She wrestled with forgiving him for moving on, for the pain his new relationship caused her. More difficult still was forgiving herself, for the lies, the avoidance, and the role she played in their unraveling. This process was neither linear nor easy. It involved setbacks and breakthroughs, moments of despair and glimmers of peace. The passage of time brought a gradual softening of the sharp edges of her pain. Each day that passed without the constant sting of heartbreak was a small victory. She learned to find moments of joy and gratitude amid the sorrow. She discovered new interests and rediscovered old passions, ways to reconnect with herself beyond the shadow of her lost love. These small steps toward healing were often overshadowed by doubt and fear, but they also carried the promise of renewal. She began to envision a future where she could be whole again, not defined by her past mistakes or her lost relationship but by her resilience and growth. In the quiet moments of reflection, she understood that moving on was not about forgetting or erasing the past, it was about integrating the experience into the fabric of her life, allowing it to shape but not define her. She realized that healing required patience, kindness toward herself, and a willingness to embrace uncertainty. The pain of loss was a part of the journey, but it was not the destination. The path forward was one of hope, where the wounds could heal and new possibilities could emerge. As she navigated this complex emotional landscape, she slowly began to open her heart again, cautiously and with newfound strength. The fear that once paralyzed her was still present but diminished, replaced by a fragile courage to face vulnerability and intimacy on her own terms. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, that the shadows of the past would sometimes return, but she was determined to move forward. The struggle to move on had become a transformative journey, one that promised not just an end but a new beginning. The journey toward acceptance and growth unfolded gradually, a slow but profound transformation that reshaped her understanding of herself and what it meant to love and be loved. After months of emotional turmoil, sleepless nights, and relentless self-questioning, she began to find a fragile peace within the chaos. It was not a sudden revelation but rather a series of small moments where clarity emerged, where the fog of pain lifted just enough to reveal the path ahead. Acceptance was not about forgetting or excusing the past but about embracing it fully, acknowledging the mistakes, the fears, and the vulnerabilities that had shaped her actions and the course of the relationship. This acceptance became the foundation upon which she could build a new sense of self, one that was not defined by fear or avoidance but by resilience and courage. She started to understand that growth was intertwined with pain and loss, that the wounds she carried were also the source of her strength. Each scar told a story, a testament to survival and the capacity to learn and evolve. The breakup, the distance, and the heartbreak had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself. about her fears of intimacy, her struggles with vulnerability, and her patterns of avoidance. This self-awareness was painful but necessary, a mirror reflecting the parts of her she had long hidden away. Through this reflection, she found compassion for herself, recognizing that her actions, though flawed, were rooted in deep-seated fears and a desire to protect her heart. This compassion was the first step toward healing, a gentle kindness that replaced harsh self-judgment. With acceptance came the willingness to forgive, not just him, but herself. Forgiveness was a complex and ongoing process, a shedding of the heavy burden of blame and resentment. She realized that holding on to anger and regret only kept her tethered to the past, preventing her from moving forward. Forgiving herself for the lies she told, for the moments of weakness, and for the ways she had hurt the person she loved was perhaps the hardest part. Yet, it was also the most liberating. It allowed her to release the shackles of guilt and to reclaim her power. Forgiving him for moving on, for his new relationship, and for the pain it caused her was another step toward freedom. A recognition that their paths had diverged and that love, no matter how deeply felt, could not always endure. As she embraced this new perspective, she began to rebuild her life with intention and hope. She sought out experiences and relationships that nurtured her growth and honored her boundaries. The lessons she had learned became guiding principles, helping her navigate future connections with greater honesty and courage. She developed a deeper understanding of what it meant to be vulnerable, not as a weakness but as a strength that fostered true intimacy. This growth extended beyond her romantic relationships, influencing her friendships, family dynamics, and her relationship with herself. She became more attuned to her needs and desires, more willing to communicate openly, and more confident in setting limits that protected her well-being. The process of healing was neither linear nor without setbacks. There were moments when old fears resurfaced, when the pain felt overwhelming, and when doubts crept in. Yet, with each challenge, she found renewed strength and resilience. She learned to sit with discomfort, to lean into vulnerability, and to trust that healing was a journey rather than a destination. The emotional scars remained, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they were part of a tapestry woven from experience, growth, and the enduring capacity for love. Her story became one of transformation, a testament to the human spirit's ability to rise from heartbreak and forge a new path. The pain she endured gave way to wisdom and a deeper appreciation for the complexities of love and relationships. She recognized that true intimacy required not only connection with another but also a profound connection with oneself. This realization was empowering, a source of hope and strength that would carry her forward. In embracing acceptance and growth, she found a new sense of freedom. The freedom to love without fear, to be vulnerable without shame, and to live authentically and fully. The past, with all its pain and regret, became a part of her story but no longer its entirety. She stepped into the future with a heart open to possibility, guided by the lessons of her journey and the courage to embrace whatever lay ahead. This chapter of her life, marked by acceptance and growth, was not an end but a new beginning, a promise of healing, resilience, and the enduring power of love to transform and renew.
Thanks for watching. It means a lot. Share the video, and I'll see you soon.